The Russian spring offensive appears to be coming to an end. Meanwhile, Ukraine is generating strength for an offensive of their own. Let's run through this week's updates and talk more about the spring offensives. First, the strategic updates. Last week we discussed the child force deportation program run by Russia in the occupied Ukrainian territories. Shortly after uploading that video, the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for Vladimir Putin and the head of the Russian Commission for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova. While not a signatory to the ICC, Russia still suffers the reputational damage, as the ICC has 104 member states, each now with a legal obligation to arrest Putin if he were ever to visit. That said, this warrant is unlikely to impact the war or Putin in the near term, since Putin's circle of trust has shrunk and he largely remains within Russian borders, rarely traveling. That said, last week he did travel in a surprise visit to Crimea and Mariupol. Over the last several weeks, Putin has attempted to rebrand himself as a wartime leader. However, he has notably not visited frontline positions like Ukraine's Zelensky or Wagner's Prigozhin. I saw some speculation that this wasn't even the real Putin. However, it really doesn't make a significant difference either way. There have been long-standing concerns about Putin's health, in which case this travel would be significant. However, nothing seems to be confirmed, so in my opinion we should just take this at face value, even if the face value is just a small propaganda opportunity for Putin. What was a more important event that Putin took part in was the visit of China's Xi Jinping to Moscow, where the two met and discussed the Russia-China relationship. Xi became the first leader to meet with Putin since the ICC warrant. However, it appears that matter didn't really matter much in this meeting. Instead, the two appear to be diverging slightly in their vision for the bilateral Russia-China relationship moving forward. Prior to the visit, both published articles in each other's state medias, and it's in these articles where you start to see differing tones. Putin appears to want the relationship to move where both Russia and China stand together to oppose the West in the multipolar world order that they've spoken about in the past. Xi's article is much less intense, instead offering China as a mediator between Russia and Ukraine, but not going so far as to put China in the same corner as Russia. In the past, Xi characterized the Russia-China relationship as a no-limits partnership. However, it appears from this visit that limits are beginning to emerge. Russia has little leverage, and with the severe decline of its global standing, China is growing in dominance over Russia in this relationship, a dynamic that will be quite interesting to monitor moving forward. Another interesting dynamic we've been monitoring each week has been the political infighting among Russian leadership, particularly with Prigozhin and other Russian leaders. Last week, Prigozhin accused Russian leadership of deliberately sabotaging Wagner in Bakhmut, using a fake report from a news agency as evidence. As war of words continue, and Russian leadership has begun distancing themselves from Prigozhin. Aside from Wagner and Concord Consulting, which Prigozhin uses to house his other critical hybrid warfare asset, the Internet Research Agency, Prigozhin has little if any political capital. And being that even Wagner falls under Concord and Concord is a government contractor, his capital expands as far as the Russian government is willing to fund it. Bloomberg released a report that Wagner is considering withdrawing from the war and refocusing on its Africa mission set. Prigozhin denied this. However, again, he's ultimately at the mercy of government funding and direction. One glimpse into this is a post by Igor Girkin, who was a Russian officer during the 2014 invasion and has continued to be involved in the Donbass since. Girkin has been critical of the Russian Ministry of Defense and intelligence community since the war began, and this week he again called for leadership changes across the Ministry of Defense and FSB. Note that Girkin is just one person, but he does maintain some influence in the information space, and that, while what he says and calls for isn't at all a complete picture of how everyone is feeling, it is an indicator on where some opinions are. The infighting currently is largely centered around Russia's spring offensive and concerns of an upcoming Ukrainian offensive, and it's when we look at this picture that we begin to see a pretty interesting trend line that could mean good things for Ukraine. Russia's offensive appears to be nearing its finishing point. Despite suffering a high rate of attrition, Russia was only able to manage small, localized gains in areas around Svatova, Kremenna, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Volodar. The BBC and Russian opposition news service called MediaZone published casualty figures, which approximate Russian KIA to be somewhere between 20 to 40,000, with total casualties ranging from 150 to 200,000. We've already discussed the massive losses of Russia's tank fleet, and this week it was observed that Russia is pulling T-55s and T-54s from its deep storage, among other types of older antiquated kit. Despite these being extremely old platforms, they're still tanks, and still tanks are sturdy and can kill, so to an infantryman they're probably not a dramatic jump from a T-72, but to a Leopard 2, they definitely are. Having said all of this, I still haven't seen anything to indicate that these are going directly into the fight, so we're just going to have to monitor and time will probably intel. Ukrainian intelligence has also publicly claimed that Russia is incapable of multi-pronged offensive operations, which can be evidenced by the lack of progress in this offensive and the collapse of their initial assault in the beginning of the war. It's on this note that we begin to see a separation in capabilities between Ukraine and Russia. While Russia is losing combat capability, Ukraine is generating. It's believed, and I want to note not confirmed, so take this with a grain of salt, that Ukraine is withholding combat power to generate strength for a spring offensive. And this includes the formation of new combat forces to breach enemy defensive lines, and the withholding of artillery ammunition to overwhelm Russian firepower in localized areas. Ukrainian troops who have been spending the past few months training in Western training centers to use different systems like the Patriot air defense system, Bradleys, Leopards, Challengers, and more are also starting to return to Ukraine. The question is now how quickly Ukraine can integrate these new platforms and units into their formation. Ukraine doesn't need to overwhelm Russia across the entire front line, and that's probably not possible anyway. However, they do need to overwhelm Russia in a few key areas where it counts. And having said that, Russia still has a significant amount of firepower and personnel, and while their offensive appears to be stalling out and failing, their forces would have to suffer an obscenely high rate of attrition to force any kind of significant collapse. Instead, Russia may be pulling back its own offensive to be better prepared to defend and respond to a Ukrainian offensive. The next several weeks will be critical, and we'll be monitoring this in the future updates, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. With this strategic picture established, let's dive into the tactical one. The Lvova-Kremenna line largely remains as it did last week, with some small gains for Russia near Kremenna. Fighting continues to be heavy in this area despite the lack of movement on the map. South towards Bakhmut, Russian forces continue an incremental squeeze of Ukrainian forces in the city. However, progress remains slow but no less deadly. Ukraine launched counterattacks in the southwest to relieve pressure on the open corridor to and from the city, and have largely been successful in defending against assaults from both Wagner and Russian VDV assault units outside of the city. The fighting inside the city is block to block, while outside the city Russia seeks to surround and isolate Bakhmut from resupply and reinforcement. Ukrainian General Syrskyi, who is in charge of the Ukrainian forces in and around the city, noted that Russia is suffering a high level of attrition and that this will lead to exploits for Ukraine in the near future. Obviously, this appears to be hinting at an upcoming Ukrainian offensive, but it will be dependent on the condition of Russian reserves in the area. We probably won't see a massive breakthrough like in Kharkiv here. Instead, a grinding offensive like in Kherson, which may lead to local breakthroughs and an overall degradation of the Russian defensive position. Overall, Russia's attack rate in and around Bakhmut appears to be slowing down, which may indicate that they're running out of offensive momentum since this is the second consecutive week that their attacks have slowed down. South towards Donetsk city, Russia made some gains around Avdiivka. This battle often gets overshadowed by Bakhmut, but it's still an intense battle where Ukraine has been able to grind down Russian forces. This is also an area where the rate of attacks has increased. Russia appears to be implementing some lessons from Bakhmut here by attacking around the city in an attempt to cut off supply to Avdiivka. However, this is another area where Ukraine has managed to hold fairly well while imposing costs to Russia. To the south in Zaphorizhia, Russia continues to develop its defensive position in anticipation of Ukrainian attack, while to the west in Kherson, Ukraine continues raids across the river on Russian positions. Here's a video on what we've learned about war from 2022 that extracts lessons from this war that I think are important to remember. And here's a playlist to the weekly updates for more context on this video. Be sure to like this video and drop a comment on what you think we're currently seeing and what you expect to see in the near future.